Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in South Carolina. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The first surviving mention of her appears in a faded ledger from Barnwell County, dated April 1849. A single entry, written in the tight, formal script of a plantation clerk, records the name Dinah, height near 7 feet, strong shoulders, purchased from Charleston Market. The record ends with one short annotation in the margin: disposition uncertain. Stories say that when Dinah first arrived at the Corbin estate, she was quiet. The estate sat on a rise near the Salkehatchie River, humid, surrounded by cypress swamps and thick fog that clung to the fields. Neighbors later described her as a towering woman with eyes like a storm about to break. Some said she spoke little English. Others claimed she was from the Upper Congo, or perhaps from one of the inland tribes near the Niger. Her owner, William Corbin, was the son of an ailing tobacco planter. Local archives describe him as an irritable man, fond of drink, fearful of uprisings. This was a common fear in those years. Even though the Stono Rebellion had taken place over a century earlier, its memory still haunted the region. Every white landowner knew the story of slaves marching south toward Spanish Florida, of the punishment that followed. Corbin's fear turned into cruelty. Witnesses from neighboring farms recalled hearing the sound of lashes echoing across the fields. One field hand later testified, though her account appears only in a fragment of a Reconstruction-era interview, that Mr. Corbin, he feared her strength, and so he beat her for it. Then, one humid night in late June, a storm rolled across the county. The lightning struck the barn roof, setting it ablaze. Amid the confusion, Corbin was found dead in his quarters, his neck broken cleanly, his body sprawled beside the overturned chair. No weapon was found. The coroner's report, one of the few documents still legible, reads, "Death by unnatural force, neck displaced between the third and fourth vertebrae, unlikely caused by fall or accident." Dinah was gone. Her bedding was empty, her footprints visible in the mud leading toward the swamp. The dogs refused to follow. For 3 days, search parties combed the riverbanks. The sheriff, a man named Elias Kroom, wrote that no ordinary human could have waded that far into the marsh and lived. Some swore they saw her silhouette in the dawn mist, standing waist-deep in the water, motionless. Others said they heard her singing, a low, foreign melody that seemed to vibrate through the trees. By the week's end, the estate's servants were sold, and the Corbin family name quietly vanished from the county rolls. The remaining townsfolk rarely spoke her name aloud. They began referring to her only as the Giantess of Salkehatchie. In the months that followed, silence settled over Barnwell County. Yet beneath that silence lay a nervous current. The Corbin estate was left to ruin. The charred barn, the broken fences, the empty slave quarters still standing under vines and moss. According to an 1851 church register, travelers began avoiding the old road that passed by it. Wagon drivers preferred a longer route through Bamberg rather than cross what they started calling Giantess Hollow. One of the earliest detailed accounts comes from Reverend Josiah Ames, a circuit preacher who rode through the region that autumn. His diary, preserved in the archives of a small seminary in Columbia, includes a short entry dated October 3, 1849. Stopped near the Corbin plantation at dusk. Locals warned against it. They speak of a woman, enormous, black as pitch, seen among the trees. I dismissed it as fear. But near midnight I heard singing. Not words, a low chant that seemed to carry through the rain. The Reverend's horse was found wandering near the river the next morning. Ames himself reappeared in Charleston 3 days later, shaken, unable to remember how he got there. He left the ministry within the year. Local newspapers barely mentioned these events. The Charleston Courier published a 2-line notice: "Runaway negress of unusual stature, responding to the name Dinah, dangerous, reward offered." But there is no record of anyone ever claiming that reward. During the 1850s, several plantations along the Salkehatchie corridor reported missing livestock, trampled fences, and unearthly howls heard before dawn. Sheriff Croom, still in office, organized another search in 1853, taking with him 2 hounds and 3 deputies. His report survives only in fragments, yet one line remains: "Found tracks larger than a man's, barefoot, leading toward the Cypress Basin. The prints ceased suddenly by the water's edge." Theories grew. Some said Dinah drowned herself in the swamp, dragged by her own guilt. Others believed she fled north under a false name. There was even a rumor, whispered in taverns, that she had joined a band of fugitives rumored to raid storehouses at night and vanish by morning. What unsettled many was the detail that repeated across every account: the size of the footprints, the stride, too long, too wide, too steady. "Like the steps of a creature made for the wilderness," one deputy wrote. Around that same time, Dr. Abram Leland, a physician from Beaufort, began collecting what he called slave physiology notes for a medical journal. He mentioned hearing of an Amazonian woman near Salkehatchie, stronger than any man, said to have crushed her master's neck between her hands. His tone was skeptical, yet his note inspired several letters from readers claiming to have seen a woman of impossible height, traveling with freedmen moving toward Georgia. By 1856, the case had become a ghost story told to frighten children, a warning not to venture near the swamps after dark. But for some, the fear was rooted not in superstition, but in memory. Because in the back of the local courthouse, a ledger still bore her name, written in faded ink beside a single word: unrecovered. By the late 1850s, Dinah's story had drifted from report to rumor, from rumor to uneasy legend. The county grew, plantations changed hands, but the swamp remained, vast, damp, and whispering. Children in Barnwell learned early not to play near the riverbanks, where, as elders warned, the giant woman still walks when the moon is thin. Yet among adults, there were quieter whispers, spoken in confidence. A few planters confessed to losing workers who vanished into the timberlands. One, a Mr. Tillman Graves, told a visiting surveyor that he found smoke from a hidden camp deep in the pines, too organized to be random vagrants. His overseer, however, refused to investigate. The man later resigned, citing noises and voices that mock the wind. When tensions in the South began to rise, and the threat of abolition spread through rumor, Dinah's story was sometimes used by firebrand speakers as proof of what they called the barbarity beneath servitude. But the tone of such retellings was never consistent, part warning, part justification. What remained constant was the fear that something had survived out there, beyond the law. In 1858, a traveling correspondent for the Augusta Chronicle passed through the area and later wrote an unpublished account preserved in the newspaper's archives. He described meeting a trapper named Caleb Ruther, who swore he had spoken with a woman near 7 feet tall, with a voice like thunder in fog. According to his claim, she lived with 2 others in a hut raised on stilts above the marsh, trading furs for salt and powder. Ruther said she never gave her name, but when he asked where she came from, she answered only, "From where the whips still sing." It was around this time that the memory of the Stono Rebellion resurfaced among plantation owners, that old 1739 uprising when enslaved men and women marched south, seeking freedom and the colonial border. Clerks began quietly filing precautionary notices about gatherings or songs that echoed the cadence of revolt. And in more than one plantation letter, Dinah's shadow was invoked, as if she were both a warning and an omen. Dr. Leland, who had earlier written of her in his medical notes, returned to the subject in an 1859 lecture. He referred to her indirectly, a specimen of giantism among the African race, noted for violent resistance. His students, however, recalled that his voice shook while reading that passage. Some said he had received an anonymous letter from the interior counties claiming Dinah was alive, older, but still impossibly strong. When the Civil War began 2 years later, the Corbin property was already half swallowed by moss and mud. Soldiers from both sides occasionally camped there, using the ruined house for shelter. One Confederate sergeant later wrote that on a foggy night in 1862, they heard heavy footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. The next morning, 2 rifles were gone, their prints leading into the trees. Whether it was her or another fugitive, no one ever knew. But the men, hardened from battle, refused to stay another night on that ground. They burned the last of the Corbin house to ash and left before dusk. After the war's end in 1865, South Carolina entered a restless quiet. The plantations lay in ruin, fields untended, and new faces from the north arrived to survey what remained. Freedmen's Bureau agents compiled lists of the formerly enslaved, but no trace of Dinah appeared among them, not under her name, nor under any known alias. Yet one entry in the Bureau's 1866 Assistance and Relief Ledger caught the attention of later historians. It describes a woman known locally as Aunt Dinah, living in a half-collapsed cabin between Barnwell and Orangeburg. Her age was listed as unknown, her height remarkable. The clerk added, "This woman bears great scars about the shoulders and speaks of no kin. Locals treat her with an odd mix of fear and reverence." When a young field inspector named Henry Pomeroy visited her, he recorded her words with a kind of unease. His note reads, "She does not speak much. When asked about the past, she said, 'It's buried where the swamp drinks light.' Her voice low, steady. She lifted a barrel without strain when I offered water." Pomeroy's journal vanishes from the Bureau's archives after that entry. No record explains why. By 1868, rumors began anew. Hunters swore that in the cypress woods east of the Corbin ruins, they found a graveyard of animals, deer, dogs, even cattle, their necks twisted as if by a single violent motion. Others said they had seen fires in the swamp at night, blue and silent, moving like lanterns over the water. That same year, a letter from Reverend Paul Givens of Charleston surfaced, addressed to Dr. Abram Leland. Givens wrote, "The woman you once described may yet live. I saw her with my own eyes near the Salkehatchie crossing. She walked beside a boy, barefoot, carrying a bundle of reeds. She looked upon me not with madness, but with memory." Leland, now elderly, replied in disbelief, calling it a confusion of imagination and faith. Yet not long after, Leland's own notes began referencing the persistence of bodily legend, a term scholars would later use when studying how oral tales become local history. The doctor himself died in 1871, his journals incomplete. Meanwhile, the people around Salkehatchie grew uneasy again. Some refused to cross the marsh after sunset. One carpenter, rebuilding fences along the edge, claimed to hear a voice humming, a tune without words that echoed across the water. The sheriff dismissed it as frog song carried by wind. but older residents remembered the old plantation stories and whispered that the giantess had returned to guard something buried deep. Even travelers wrote of strange experiences. A railroad engineer passing through in 1872 told his crew he saw a woman standing on the embankment at dawn, tall enough that her head brushed the hanging moss. He blew the whistle, but she didn't move. When they passed again at dusk, the same figure stood there still, motionless, the same tilt of the head, the same faint shimmer of water beneath her feet. No one ever went to verify it. The marsh had already taken too many. By the mid-1870s, the story of the giantess had become a strange blend of folklore and whispered record, crossing county lines through wandering preachers and river traders. Some swore she was dead, others insisted she was living somewhere beyond the Congaree, hidden among freed families who wanted no attention from white officials. A tattered letter from a merchant named Isaiah Norrington, dated 1874, adds a chilling piece to the puzzle. Norrington wrote to a colleague in Savannah that a woman of immense stature had arrived at his store one evening, barefoot, wrapped in an old army coat. She asked only for salt and tobacco, paid with coins worn and old, and said little else. But what unsettled him most, he wrote, was her left hand, the fingers thick, the joints swollen, as though they'd never healed from some terrible strain. He described her eyes as gray in the lamplight, not black. When he asked where she lived, she replied, "Where the river won't tell." Around this time, small newspapers in Charleston and Columbia occasionally published brief, uncertain notes about a tall, colored woman traveling alone, said to be touched in the mind. Some editors dismissed these reports as rural fiction, but to those who lived near the Salkehatchie, each mention brought renewed unease. County school teachers collecting local folklore in 1877 included her in their notes. One woman, Miss Lydia Moore, recorded that older freedwomen still warned children with the phrase, "Mind your temper, or the giantess will find you." But Miss Moore, more curious than afraid, sought out the old Corbin property herself. Her surviving journal, found in an attic decades later, offers one of the last first-hand descriptions before the site vanished completely. She wrote, "The house no longer stands. Only the hearth remains, black with age. There are bones of animals scattered near the ball. Well, deer, perhaps hogs. I thought I saw footprints, but they sank as I looked. The swamp hums at dusk. It is the sound of the earth breathing." Miss Moore fell ill shortly after her visit. Her family said she suffered recurring fever dreams of a woman standing in the doorway, her shadow taller than the ceiling. She died that winter of pneumonia, though locals whispered she had brought something back from the marsh. By the early 1880s, floods swept through Barnwell County, washing away what little remained of the Corbin estate. County officials took the chance to clear the old road, declaring the land unfit for residents. What they did not announce publicly was that workers found a wooden cross nailed high into a cypress tree, carved with a single word in uneven letters, "Forgive." No one could say who placed it there. Some thought it the act of a preacher passing through. Others believed it marked the grave of the one who had fled into the swamp so many years before. Even now, records from that flood year mention the same eerie detail. Despite the destruction, the area around the old Corbin grounds stayed unnaturally dry, as if the waters refused to claim it. By 1883, the Corbin land was little more than a memory, its boundaries erased by water and overgrowth. Surveyors for the new rail line avoided the area entirely, describing the ground as unstable and oddly resonant underfoot. Still, curiosity lingered among those who'd grown up with the old stories. Some said that on still nights the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard pacing near the riverbank, slow, even, deliberate, like a giant's metronome against the mud. That same year, Professor Jeremiah W. Crane from Columbia College visited Barnwell County while compiling accounts of postbellum folklore. His notes, later discovered in a forgotten library chest, mention the tall woman of Salkehatchie, possibly tied to earlier resistance tales. Crane had studied the Stono Rebellion extensively, tracing its echoes through oral tradition. What fascinated him was how the story of Dinah, though separated by a century, mirrored the same rhythm of defiance, survival, and silence that haunted the rebellion's memory. Crane interviewed aging residents, both white and black, gathering fragments of a shared myth. One freedman, Isaac Harland, who claimed to have worked briefly on the Corbin estate as a child, said, "She weren't no ghost, sir. She was flesh and bone. I seen her carry a hog over one shoulder like kindling. She said the Lord made her big to carry others' pain." Harland's statement might have been dismissed as exaggeration, but his description matched that of earlier accounts: the height, the scars, and the calm, almost regal demeanor. Crane noted that the man spoke without fear, only a quiet respect, as though describing someone half human, half legend. Later, while visiting the county courthouse, Crane found a locked cabinet containing records from before the war. Among them was a letter signed by Sheriff Elias Croom in 1853, the same man who once led the search through the swamps. The paper was brittle, its ink faded, but one line was still legible. "If she lives still, she is not to be hunted. She has paid her due." Crane copied that sentence into his field notes, underlining it twice. He would later write that this small act of recorded mercy, from a man tasked with enforcing the slave code, hinted at a deeper understanding of guilt and consequence in that isolated county. When Crane returned to Columbia, he planned to publish his findings under the title Echoes from the Swamp, Oral Histories of the Low Country. But the manuscript was never printed. In a final letter to a colleague, he confessed, "There are truths the land will not release. Some stories end where they began, beneath the water." The professor died of fever in 1884, and his papers were sealed by his family, later lost in a house fire. Yet before his death, Crane reportedly told one student that while traveling back through Barnwell, he saw a figure standing on a ridge above the marsh, tall, motionless, wrapped in a dark shawl. He didn't stop. He only wrote later, "The posture was neither threat nor plea, only watchfulness, as if guarding what cannot be forgiven." In the quiet years that followed Professor Crane's death, the story of the giantess faded again into local murmurs, kept alive mostly by the elderly and the curious few who wandered too close to the Salkehatchie marshes. The land remained untamed, marked only by the skeletal frame of an oak that once stood near the Corbin hearth. Hunters said its trunk was split down the center as though twisted by immense force, a detail that would soon fuel new whispers. An 1886 letter from a farmer named Nathaniel Pruitt survives in the archives of a Charleston Historical Society. Pruitt wrote to his brother, "There is a tree out near the bend where the river slows, split clean as if the heavens cracked it. I heard it before I saw it, a sound like bone breaking. When I reached the spot, the air smelled of rain, though the sky was clear." Not long after that letter, several locals began reporting that their livestock had gone missing. Not stolen, but found days later, their necks broken, their bodies laid neatly in the tall grass. Some blamed escaped convicts. Others said the land was cursed. By 1888, the newly formed Barnwell County Historical Society began collecting these tales, hoping to separate fact from fable. Among their papers is a curious statement from a woman named Margaret Key, then in her 60s. "When I was a child, my grandmother told me that Dinah was no monster. She was a woman wronged beyond measure. She did not flee. She waited. she waits still. That phrase, "she waits still," appears again in another document, this time in a field diary belonging to a local constable, Richard Morrow. He was dispatched that same year to investigate reports of trespassers near the old Corbin land. Morrow wrote, "The ground there feels hollow, as if it hides tunnels beneath. At dusk, I saw movement, not the stride of a man. Taller, slower, deliberate. I called out 'B,' but my voice went nowhere, swallowed by the fog." Morrow never filed a full report. Weeks later, his horse was found tethered near the swamp's edge, its reins intact, its saddle missing. Morrow himself was never recovered. When officials sent men to search, they found no trace of him, but they did discover something else: a ring half buried in the soil. Old, plain, engraved with initials so faint they could hardly be read, W.C. If genuine, it would have belonged to William Corbin, the man whose death began the legend nearly 40 years earlier. The find renewed interest in the old tale, and the county newspapers published short columns about the ghost of the giantess. Some wrote with disbelief, others with fascination. A few even claimed to see her shadow crossing the riverbank at dawn, always facing east, as if waiting for something that never came. The articles stirred old memories, but as quickly as the excitement rose, it vanished again. The swamp reclaimed its silence, and with it the people's will to dig further. It was as though the land itself demanded its story remain unfinished, half submerged, half remembered. By 1890, the tale of the giantess had become one of South Carolina's most quietly feared legends, the kind that older folks mentioned only when the lamps burned low. Yet among scholars and travelers, it began to attract new attention. A few northern journalists, drawn by Reconstruction-era folklore, came south to investigate. One of them, a correspondent named Clara Wentworth, wrote an unpublished feature titled "The Shadow Woman of the Salkehatchie." Only fragments of her draft survive in her papers at the Library of Congress. Wentworth's notes describe her journey upriver by flatboat, guided by two local men who refused to camp overnight near the old Corbin site. She recorded, "The swamp feels endless, trees leaning like mourners, the air dense with sound, yet void of life. At dusk, I glimpsed a shape across the water, tall, motionless. It was not imagination. Both guides saw it, and one crossed himself. When she returned to Charleston, she confided to a friend that she believed the woman still lived, perhaps decades older, sustained by isolation and the reverence of those who whispered her name. But Wentworth died suddenly in 1891 of fever before her article could be published. Her family sealed her papers for nearly half a century. Meanwhile, in Barnwell County, another figure emerged in local record, a freedwoman known only as Mother D. Census takers in 1890 listed her age as about 70. Her dwelling was noted along the old river bend. Her height, they remarked, remarkably tall for a woman of advanced age. That entry vanished from the following decade's census. A schoolteacher from Bamberg, Mr. Edwin Clark, recorded an encounter around that same time while returning home at twilight. Something crossed the path ahead of me. A woman, or what I thought was one. She wore no shoes. The ground trembled faintly with her step. I called out, asking, as if she needed help. She turned her head slowly and said, "No man can help what's already done." Then she was gone into the mist. Clark's testimony was dismissed by his peers as imagination, but his notebook contained sketches, rough outlines of a towering figure, shoulders broad, posture upright, one arm hanging slightly twisted as though once broken. By the winter of that same year, several lumber workers clearing pine near the swamp claimed to have found remnants of an old cabin on stilts. Beneath its floorboards, they discovered a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were bones, small ones, likely animal, and a folded scrap of paper. Only 2 words were legible beneath the stains of time: I remember. When news of the discovery reached Charleston, a few surviving students of Professor Crane revisited his old papers, noting the parallel to his final observation, that the posture was one of watchfulness. Some began to speculate whether Dinah's presence had been less of vengeance and more of penitence, a kind of eternal guardianship over the land that had broken her. Even today, those who walk the river trail speak of a strange heaviness in the air near the bend, a sensation that time hesitates there, as if waiting for acknowledgement. Locals will tell you, no birds sing in that patch of swamp. Not one. By the early 1890s, the swamp had reclaimed nearly everything: the path, the fences, even the faint outline of the Corbin fields. The earth had folded over its own memory, as if determined to hide the story forever. Yet memory persisted, carried by those who could not forget. One such voice was that of Reverend Jonathan Lee, a traveling preacher whose circuit took him through the lowlands each spring. His journal, preserved in the archives of the old Charleston Seminary, contains an entry dated April 2nd, 1893. They speak of her as if she still walks. The tall one, the wronged one. I passed a hollow where the ground sinks into water. It was silent, no frog, no bird. A woman's figure stood far off in the reeds. When I blinked, it was gone. I prayed, though I do not know for whom. Reverend Lee later told his congregation that the land remembers pain, and that some souls are bound not by sin, but by the echo of injustice. His words unsettled the parish, and within months he was quietly reassigned. That same year, an amateur historian from Beaufort, Miss Sarah Dunham, began compiling what she called Accounts of the Vanished. Among her letters to a colleague was a description of her own trip to Barnwell. The locals will not utter her name. They call her simply the Tall Woman. Children are told she guards the graves of the wronged. An old woman near the river told me, if you hear humming, you turn back. She don't want to be seen. Dunham's field notes mention the Stono Rebellion again. How fear of insurrection had shaped generations of cruelty and silence. She theorized that Dinah's story endured because it embodied that suppressed fear, made flesh and unforgettable. In every county, she wrote, there must be one who carries the memory of the lash. Perhaps she was chosen by fate or by rage itself. Late in 1894, a strange incident revived public curie. Ozity. A crew clearing brush for a new telegraph line near the Salkehatchie discovered what appeared to be an old grave, marked only by a rotted wooden stake. Underneath the disturbed soil, they found not a body, but remnants of fabric, coarse linen, and a set of iron shackles bent open by force. The workers refused to continue, claiming the ground trembled when they lifted the chains. When the county coroner arrived, he dismissed their claims and ordered the items buried again. But one of his assistants, a young man named Samuel Price, took a single shackle link as a keepsake. Within weeks, Price reportedly fell ill. His widow later wrote to the local paper that he woke crying in his sleep, saying he heard a woman's voice by the river asking to be left alone. No investigation followed. The marsh was marked restricted in county maps that year, officially due to flooding risk, unofficially because the workers refused to enter. And so, by the closing years of the century, the legend of the Giantess slipped once more beneath the surface of public talk, a name too dangerous, too sorrowful, too alive in the silence of that wet, haunted land. But in Barnwell County, the elders still said one thing with quiet certainty. The swamp forgets no sin, and neither does she. As the century drew to its end, South Carolina was a state divided between progress and shadow. Railroads cut through the lowlands, factories rose along the coast, and yet, in the countryside, the old stories lingered like fog that refused to lift. The Giantess of Salkehatchie, by now a name spoken only in whispers, had become something between warning and confession. In 1896, a young journalist named Thomas Everly from Savannah was sent to collect legends of the Reconstruction era for a serialized magazine feature. His letters to his editor describe an unexpected obsession that overtook him while in Barnwell County. Every road I take leads back to the same place, the swamp. People shut their doors when I ask. They say, "Don't go calling on her." But who is she now, if she ever was? Every shadow here seems to answer that question differently. Everly camped near the riverbank for 3 nights. His journal tells of strange noises, slow, rhythmic footfalls, and a low voice humming without words. On the final night he wrote, "Saw her, I swear it. Tall, older, wrapped in gray cloth. She looked at me with neither anger nor mercy, only recognition." That was his last entry. Days later, locals found his camp abandoned, his tent torn down, but his belongings undisturbed. The article was never submitted, and his body was never recovered. The only object missing was his fountain pen. The following spring, when new workers arrived to replace the telegraph line crew who had refused to return, they found the initials T.E. carved into a cypress trunk near the edge of the swamp. Beneath it, a single line, "I saw her once." The county coroner at the time, a man named Dr. Henry Alcott, ordered the trunk cut down, calling it nonsense unfit for modern minds. But the loggers refused. One reportedly said, "We ain't cutting the tree she touched. The trunk still stands. Today, weathered, split by lightning, but bearing faint grooves that look, under the right light, like the outline of a hand pressed deep into its bark." By the late 1890s, the Salkehatchie lands were officially declared unsurveyable territory. The state left them untouched. But fishermen continued to tell of strange sights, ripples moving against the current, shapes standing where no ground should be. In 1898, a letter from a teacher named Marion Willis to her sister provides one of the last recorded testimonies of the century. "It is quiet here, but not peaceful. When the sun sets, the trees seem to lean closer together. The colored folk tell of a woman who guards the place. They leave food by the riverbank for her, rice, salt, a single candle. I asked why. They said it keeps the storms away." The act became yearly ritual, an unspoken pact between the living and whatever still walked there. When storms threatened the county, offerings appeared again, simple, humble, and gone by morning. Whether gratitude or fear drove them, no one could say. But each time the winds rose and the rain poured, the river swelled without flooding. And in the minds of those who still remembered Dinah, that mercy, silent, unclaimed, felt like her doing. When the new century dawned, progress swept through the lowlands like a second flood. Telegraph lines buzzed, sawmills whined, and modern maps began redrawing the forgotten corners of South Carolina. But one area remained blank, a misshapen patch labeled simply as impassable swamp. It was there, locals said, that the giantess still kept her watch. In 1901, a railway engineer named Oliver Brandt filed a report with the Atlantic Line Company describing unusual ground tremors near mile marker 77. His words were dry and professional, but one line stood out. At 2:17 a.m., The men and I heard the sound of something moving parallel to the tracks. Heavy steps, steady, no echo. Could not identify animal or human source. No visual confirmation. The air smelled of iron. Brandt's crew refused to continue work that night, claiming that their lanterns dimmed all at once, though their oil was fresh. The next morning, they discovered deep impressions in the soft soil beside the tracks. Large, bare, unmistakably human. When the company sent investigators, the prints had filled with water. That same year, the county's oldest resident, 92-year-old Ruth Kroom, a descendant of the sheriff who had once searched for Dinah, gave a final interview to a visiting scholar from the University of South Carolina. She told him, "My granddaddy said he looked for her, but he never wanted to find her. Said she weren't lost. Said she was waiting for the land to remember." The scholar's notes also mention that Ruth's family kept an old rusted key on their mantel, said to have belonged to her grandfather's trunk. On its tag, faded by time, were the words, "Do not open until she's gone." No one knew what it meant. By 1903, a new generation had begun to doubt the legend entirely. The newspapers called it old superstition. But one article in the state newspaper, now lost, except for a sly clipping preserved in a private collection, told of a tall woman seen walking through fog near the Salkehatchie Bridge, her silhouette illuminated by lightning. The witness, a local fisherman, swore her feet did not touch the ground. Modern minds dismissed it, of course. Yet for those whose families had lived there since before the war, disbelief offered little comfort. Every few years, someone would disappear, a trapper, a drifter, a hunter who wandered too far into the reeds. The sheriff's office called them accidents. The people called them reminders. There was one final detail in that same clipping, easily overlooked. The reporter mentioned that after the storm that night, the bridge itself had shifted slightly, as though lifted and set back down. Engineers blamed soil movement. Locals didn't argue. They just said quietly, "She's still strong enough." As years went on, fewer dared to visit that part of the swamp. The trees grew thicker, the water blacker. Maps erased the roads, and the county records stopped mentioning the Corbin estate altogether. But the old songs, the low, wordless hymns passed down among freed families, still carried a name never written, but always known. When the wind passes through those trees, even now, the melody sounds like breath drawn through sorrow. Steady, patient, eternal. By 1905, Barnwell County had changed beyond recognition. New churches rose where the old fields once stretched, and the iron bridges along the Salkehatchie turned the swamp into a ghost of its former self. Yet, for those who had lived long enough to see both centuries, there was an unspoken truth. Progress might cover the land, but it could not silence it. In that year, the local paper, the Carolina Advocate, published a curious piece titled Echoes of the Old Road. The author, writing under the initials H.L., claimed to have found the last remnant of the Corbin line, a diary belonging to a distant cousin of William Corbin. The entries were mostly mundane, weather notes, supply tallies, family illnesses. But one page, dated July 1849, the month of Corbin's death, read simply, "She looked at me before it happened. No hatred, only knowing." The editor dismissed it as a hoax, but copies of the clipping spread through the county. For many, it reopened a wound they thought time had sealed. Church sermons spoke of forgiveness, while older freed families left food again by the riverbank, rice, tobacco, and sometimes a single violet. They called it the offering for the one who remembers. That same summer, an aging photographer named Matthew Godfrey passed through Barnwell on assignment to document the reconstruction of the rail line. He stayed in a small boarding house run by a widow who claimed her mother had once seen the giantess herself. Godfrey's diary survives in fragments, but one entry, dated June 18, 1905, reads, "I aimed my lens toward the trees before dawn. For a second, through the mist, I saw her. A tall outline, the water still around her knees. The plate cracked when I developed it. No image, only light, burned too bright at the center." He left the area 2 days later, refusing to speak of what he'd witnessed. The broken glass plate remained, yet among his belongings until his death, when his daughter donated it to a Charleston museum. Experts have examined it since. Some see only a flaw in the exposure. Others claim faint streaks shaped like shoulders, like arms reaching downward. A year later, a survey team widening the railway recorded something even stranger. At the exact site of Godfrey's photograph, the ground below their equipment vibrated in a steady rhythm, as if pulsing. The foreman wrote in his report, "Could be underground water," but the men refused to continue. They said it felt like the heart of something that never stopped beating. That fall, a minister from Orangeburg, Reverend Caleb Horn, led a prayer group into the area, intending to bless the haunted ground. Only fragments of his sermon remain, scrawled in the margins of his Bible. "We call her a monster because she survived what none should. We call her cursed because she remembers what we forget." After that, the county stopped trying to sanctify or explain the swamp. They left it to itself, untamed and unvisited, the road officially decommissioned and erased from new maps by 1907. Yet the air near that old path, travelers say, still feels strangely charged, thick, heavy, like a held breath. Some claim that if you pause long enough, you can hear faint humming beneath the wind, deep and low, as if the land itself is keeping rhythm with the heart that once raged and never rested. By 1908, stories of the giantess had dwindled to whispers among the elderly. A tale told around hearths or churchyards when the nights grew long and the air hung heavy with the smell of rain. The younger generation called it superstition, but a few, the ones who had grown up hearing their grandmothers speak of the woman in the swamp, knew better than to mock it aloud. That same year, a small group of historians from Charleston College began a survey of vanishing oral histories of the Low Country. Among their field notes lies the testimony of one old woman, listed only as Sister Calinda, aged 87. Her words were written phonetically, preserving her Gullah dialect. "She still walk, child, big as a tree, ain't evil, just tired. She guard de pan so we don't have to. That's why de river quiet. That's why no bird sing there." The researchers dismissed it as folklore, but noted the precision in her description. The location, the river bend, the old cypress with a split trunk. When they arrived there days later, they found the place exactly as described. Even after decades of change, the split cypress still stood, its trunk hollow but alive. Inside its base, one of the students found a piece of cloth wedged into the bark. Coarse linen, stiff with age, knotted tightly. It was left undisturbed. Word of the discovery reached Charleston newspapers, which published a brief piece titled "Relic of the Corbin Swamp Found." For a short time, the legend stirred again. Reporters speculated about escaped slaves, folk saints, even feral tribes. But the local editor of the Barnwell Gazette ended the debate with a single chilling column. "Some things are not meant to be exhumed. The swamp has its keeper. Let her keep it." That winter, a traveling painter from Savannah, James Trask, visited the area hoping to capture the legend on canvas. He stayed in a farmhouse near the Old Bend and spent 3 days sketching. On the fourth night, The landlady awoke to find him standing outside in the cold, barefoot, staring toward the trees. He said softly, "She's taller than I imagined." When Trask returned home, he completed a painting titled "The Woman by the Water." The image showed a towering silhouette, her face obscured, her hand resting gently on the surface of the river. The work was never exhibited publicly. He called it unfinished. After his death in 1910, it was found hanging backward on his studio wall, as though he couldn't bear to see it. Those who viewed it later said the brush strokes seemed to shift under light, the water glimmering faintly, as if something beneath it breathed. A professor from Columbia wrote that the painting captured not horror, but endurance, the quiet defiance of a spirit too large for its own time. Around that same period, letters from the nearby towns began to mention a familiar occurrence: floods that stopped short of the Corbin bend, as though the waters bent away. Locals took it as a sign of protection, the giantess watching still, keeping balance between memory and forgiveness. Even the oldest among them would say it in a hush. She broke what broke her. And then she stayed. By 1911, the world had begun to move faster than the old stories could keep up. The railroads brought strangers who laughed at the idea of curses, and new towns rose, where once the swamps had swallowed every path. Yet, even as the region modernized, there remained one blank spot on every map, a stretch of land that cartographers left untouched, the low, mist-cloaked hollow near the Salkehatchie. That spring, a geographer named Dr. Arthur Mallory from the University of Georgia decided to explore it. His field log, later found among his papers after his death, reads, "Entered the old Corbin tract. The silence here is total. Even the insects avoid it. Air damp, thick with scent of peat and iron. Found remnants of a foundation, perhaps the Corbin house. Notable depression nearby, too regular to be natural." He stayed 2 nights, documenting soil density and tree growth. On the 3rd morning, his assistant found their tent collapsed, Mallory's boots standing neatly outside the flap. There were no signs of struggle, only footprints leading toward the water's edge. The last line in his notebook simply states, "Something watching, not malevolent, waiting." The university filed his disappearance as an accident, blaming unstable ground. But in Barnwell County, people nodded knowingly. They said, "He went looking where he shouldn't have, and she don't take kindly to being studied." The few who dared to visit after him described subtle, unnerving sensations, the feeling of being measured, the sound of soft humming that seemed to move just beyond hearing. An article in a small Charleston journal the following year noted, "Locals continue to report that lanterns dim near the bend, and that the air grows colder as one approaches. The old families call the sensation her sigh." Around that same time, the Stono Rebellion was again mentioned in academic circles, part of a growing interest in the roots of resistance and identity in the South. A historian named Mildred Caro wrote that the giantess legend might have evolved from collective memory of rebellion suppressed, embodied in a figure who refused submission. She argued that Dinah, whether myth or flesh, symbolized a truth no document could contain, that vengeance and justice sometimes became the same act. Her essay, though scholarly, was quietly removed from circulation after complaints from local officials who feared it would agitate the colored population. Still, copies survived in private hands, where they passed like secrets between those who understood what the land had seen. In 1913, a flood struck the Salkehatchie Valley. Entire farms disappeared under brown water, except for the stretch once known as the Corbin Bend. When the storm subsided, witnesses reported that the ground there remained dry, untouched. Even the reeds stood upright. That year, An aging reverend from Orangeburg returned to the site and placed a wooden cross at the edge of the swamp, carved with the same word that had once appeared decades earlier: forgive. He left without ceremony, saying only, "Some mercy comes in silence." Since then, no one has removed that cross. Even as it rotted and leaned, new hands replaced it, always carved the same way, as if to honor not what she did, but what she endured. By 1915, the cross at the edge of the Salkehatchie had become a quiet landmark. No church claimed it, no family tended it, yet it was always there, repaired when storms broke it, repainted when time stripped it bare. Travelers began to leave small offerings at its base: river shells, tobacco, tiny bundles of dried flowers. The locals never explained why. They only said, "It keeps the water calm." That same year, a group of engineers arrived from Colombia to map new flood control channels. Their records survive in a thick, damp ledger still housed in the county archives. Buried in the margins of the report, in the handwriting of a junior assistant, is one strange note. At 4:10 p.m., felt vibration in soil, rhythmic, 5 pulses, then silence. Mr. Waller swears he saw a figure at a distance, taller than the reeds, unmoving. Lanterns failed soon after. When they returned a week later to finish measurements, the ground where they had stood was flooded, but in a perfectly circular pool, as if deliberately carved. The team marked the area unstable and moved on. A year later, a widow named Mabel Curtis, who ran a boarding house along the trade road, began hearing soft humming from the direction of the river after sunset. Her diary, preserved by her descendants, captures her confusion and awe. The sound carries like a hymn sung into the ground itself. It does not frighten me. I think it mourns. She told a traveling preacher about it, who visited her porch one evening and listened in silence. When it faded, he whispered, "It's her forgiveness taking shape." Meanwhile, across the state, historians continued to debate whether the giantess was real or imagined, an echo of the brutality that once scarred the soil. One professor from Charleston wrote that the legend endures because the guilt endures. Another dismissed it as collective delusion born of fever and fog. But every argument circled back to the same unanswerable detail. If she had never lived, why did so many remember her differently, yet precisely? By 1917, the swamp's boundaries had receded once more under drought. For the first time in half a century, the stone foundation of the Corbin house emerged, glistening under the sun. Curious townsfolk went to see it. Most left quickly. One man, a farmer named Luke Benner, claimed he found a piece of pottery shaped like a woman's hand, fingers curled slightly inward. He left it where it lay. The following night, a storm rose from a clear sky, tearing through the county with such force that barns collapsed and trees split down the middle. When morning came, the foundation was gone again, swallowed by mud. Locals took it as a warning. She wants no monuments, they said, just peace. That year also marked the 50th anniversary of emancipation. Churches across the state rang their bells, and some older congregations near the Salkehatchie held a quiet vigil. Instead of prayers for deliverance, they prayed for remembrance. In the flickering candlelight, elders spoke her name softly, Dinah, and the congregation answered, "May she rest." But in the hush that followed, the elders swore they heard a faint tremor beneath the floorboards, not thunder, not wind, just a slow, steady heartbeat echoing through the earth. By 1918, the Salkehatchie region was changing again. The Great War overseas drew young men away, and the old roads, once used for cotton wagons and river trade, grew quiet. Nature reclaimed the forgotten bends of the river. Moss hung lower, the air thicker. Yet the stories, always the stories, endured. That winter, a teacher from Charleston named Elias Morgan was commissioned by the state to collect oral traditions of the Carolina interior. His notebooks remain in the state archives, their pages stained and uneven, his handwriting neat but shaken in the later entries. He visited Barnwell, Bamberg, and finally, the outer edge of the swamp itself. Morgan's early notes are skeptical. Locals reluctant to discuss the so-called Giantess. Most regard her as moral parable rather than real event, symbol of rage and divine punishment. But his tone changes after a single evening spent near the river. The following entry, written the next morning, is sparse but haunting. Heard humming during twilight. Same rhythm reported by residents. Felt ground vibrate lightly beneath feet, like a slow breath. At 8:42 p.m., glimpsed movement between cypress trunks. Height uncertain. No animal could move like that. Lantern went out. Do not wish to return. He didn't. When Morgan's journals were later examined, archivists noted that the ink on that page had bled outward, forming dark ripples resembling fingerprints. No one could explain it. Around the same time, the Charleston Herald printed a small obituary for a Reverend Paul H. Givens, the same minister who decades before had claimed to see Dinah alive after the war. In his final sermon, transcribed by a parishioner, he had said, "The Lord sometimes leaves one soul behind to remember what the rest of us forget. Perhaps she was never meant to be found. Perhaps she keeps watch so we may rest." That line became a local saya, and repeated in households for years. She remembers so we may rest. By 1919, flooding struck again, worse than before. The Salkehatchie rose higher than living memory, swallowing farms and roads, everything but the small ridge where the cross still stood. Survivors later testified that when the waters receded, they found the wood dry, untouched. When reporters came to document the aftermath, one photograph captured a striking image, the faint outline of a woman's form, tall and thin, reflected in the floodwater behind the cross. Most dismissed it as a trick of the trees and light. But those who lived nearby said the image wasn't in the water. It was beneath it, like a shadow, waiting just below the surface. That photograph appeared once in a local exhibit before vanishing from record. Some said the negative broke when handled. Others claimed the curator refused to show it again after he began hearing soft humming in the storage room at night. By then, even skeptics avoided the subject. Too many coincidences, too many vanished names. The story had become less a legend and more a boundary, an understanding between the living and the forgotten. When people asked why no one ever cleared the swamp for farmland, the old residents would smile faintly and answer, "Because she still owns it." By 1920, the world had stepped firmly into the modern age, but the lowlands of South Carolina moved at their own pace, the past lingering there like the slow current of the Salkehatchie itself. Trains and telegraphs had stitched the coast to the rest of the country, yet that stretch of swamp remained stubbornly blank on official maps. Surveyors who tried to chart it came back with fogged lenses, ruined compasses, or, in a few cases, nothing at all. That summer, a pair of veterans from the war, Joseph Tate and Henry Russell, returned to Barnwell looking for work as timber cutters. They camped for 2 nights near the bend. Tate's surviving letter to his sister described their experience with unsettling precision. "We heard footsteps where no one was. The ground shook like something large was moving, but slow, too slow for a man, too steady for an animal. Henry swore he saw a tall shadow by the cypress, standing still while the wind bent the trees. We left our tools there. I ain't going back." When locals retrieved the tools weeks later, they found them arranged in a neat pile beside a hollow tree. Inside, someone had carved 3 words: "Not forgiven yet." By then, only the oldest residents still remembered Dinah's name. To the rest, she had become the keeper, the nameless watcher of the Salkehatchie. Each generation gave her a slightly different story, sometimes protector, sometimes revenant, always powerful, always alone. That winter, a historian named Ruth Penfield visited from Columbia to record the last oral accounts of the giantess. In her 1921 manuscript, she reflected on what she called South Carolina's silent rebellion of remembrance. She wrote, "The story of the woman who broke her master's neck endures because it holds both terror and truth. In the silence that followed the act, an entire people found a mirror of rage, of loss, of freedom clue, aimed and then buried." Penfield noted something else. When she visited the site herself, she found the swamp unusually still, the water reflecting the sky like glass. She heard no insects, no frogs, but she did hear faintly a rhythm. 5 soft pulses in the ground, spaced evenly apart. She recognized it from county records describing the vibrations engineers had once felt decades earlier. Her final line reads simply, "The land still breathes her name." After Penfield's report, the state quietly halted all plans for development near the river. The area was designated as protected wetland, though no official reason was given. In the years that followed, storms continued to rise and fall, but the bend remained strangely safe, the waters parting before it like a curtain. Travelers who dared pass through claimed to see ripples where no wind stirred, or to hear a low hum, almost like the sound of someone working in the fields at dusk, a sound old and patient. When asked what it was, the locals would only shrug. "It's her," they'd say softly, "making sure we don't forget again." And perhaps they were right. Because even as the 20th century marched forward, that patch of earth refused to change, untouched, unowned, as though one woman's final act of defiance had become its heartbeat. By the mid-1920s, the story of the giantess had drifted beyond the borders of Barnwell County. Folklorists, preachers, and travelers each retold it in their own way. Yet the details always aligned just enough to keep the legend alive. No one could decide whether she had been flesh or fable, a freed woman or a phantom. But everyone agreed on one thing: the Salkehatchie Bend still felt watched. In 1924, a new Baptist minister, Reverend James Callow, took charge of a parish near the swamp. He was young, scholarly, and dismissive of superstition. In his sermons, he called the giantess a tale born of guilt. But a year later, in his final letter to a colleague, his tone had changed. "I went to the old cross by the river. I wished to prove there was nothing there." The air turned still, too still. Then the earth moved under me. 5 slow beats. I felt them in my chest. Not menace, just sorrow. I prayed, but the words felt small. Callow resigned the following month and moved inland, never to speak publicly of what he experienced. That same autumn, a photographer documenting flood recovery took a panoramic image of the Salkehatchie Marsh. When the plate was developed, a faint figure appeared on the far ridge, tall, featureless, facing the cross. The technician assumed it was a shadow, until he noticed the reflection in the water showed no such form. The negative cracked within days. The photo was never published. By 1927, the swamp was officially designated a conservation zone. Hunters were barred from entering, and any new settlement nearby was discouraged. In the official paperwork, one reason is scribbled faintly in pencil beside the typed lines. Local resistance. Cultural significance unknown. Those who lived longest said the place changed after that. The fog grew thinner, the nights quieter. The humming, once reported so often, faded to a soft, almost imperceptible vibration beneath the ground. Like a sigh, one farmer said. Like someone finally resting. In the decades that followed, time did what it always does. It thinned memory, softened edges, and turned the woman called Dinah into myth. Her name passed from family to family, carried in songs too old to trace. Even as the century closed, field researchers still recorded the same refrain in the low country hymns, a line hummed, never written. She broke the chain and held the ground. Today, the Corbin estate exists only in maps and stories. The swamp remains, still quiet, still uninhabited. Those who wander close to the bend sometimes claim to hear footsteps in the water, slow and deliberate. Others speak of a tall silhouette glimpsed through morning mist, motionless, watching, as if ensuring the past stays buried but remembered. No proof has ever surfaced, and perhaps that is as it should be. The giantess, whether woman, symbol, or something between, became part of the land itself, her strength woven into the silence that blankets the Salkehatchie. And on still nights, when the wind falls away and the river smooths to glass, the locals say you can feel the faintest tremor underfoot, the echo of a heartbeat that has never truly stopped. South Carolina sleeps, but she, they say, still remembers.